This is the 19th of April. And this was the day in 1995 that the Oklahoma City bombing, domestic terrorist truck bombing, occurred in that city, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, at the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. The attack on April 19th, 1995, by this white Nazi, who I'll get to momentarily, Timothy McVeigh and his partner, Terry Nichols. But it occurred on the same day as the execution in Arkansas of a white supremacist named Richard Snell. And Richard Snell had predicted that a bombing would take place on the day that he was to be executed. Now, there have been rumors, none of them ever proved, that Snell's execution served as a motive for the bombing. I think it was much broader than that. First of all, I think Timothy McVeigh had his brain eaten by the same forces that now back the orange bastard, Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, even though he's an ignorant savage, he has a sense, or at least he's been told by some of the Nazis around him, that he can activate the same forces if need be. There was a little brief rehearsal of that on January 6, 2021. But the orange bastard has been told, I'm sure, that he can activate the same people who inspired Timothy McVeigh to commit acts of domestic terrorism. And this is what is concerning me about what happens in the lead up to our next presidential election and the immediate aftermath when Trump is not elected. And, for the time being, the only weapon I have, well, for the time being anyway, is to continue to talk about these issues and hope that you talk about them, and that the vast majority of the American people are fully aware, and I know television has been hammering this home, but fully aware of what we're facing right now. We're facing a psychopath, Donald Trump, who understands psychopathology and has activated it inside the twisted brains of his millions of followers. And his millions of followers have no concept of life, death, up, down, good, right, wrong, evil, nothing. They are automatons who do what this psycho son of a bitch says. And that's the reason why you probably, I'm not recommending this, but you probably should consider the idea, anyway, of making sure that you have acquired the protection necessary for you and yours when these terrorists, like the ones who blew up the Murrah Federal Building, similar to McVeigh and Nichols, when they finally get unleashed again this November. The bombing in Oklahoma City was the deadliest act of terrorism in U.S. history prior to the September 11th attacks 6 years later. And it remains the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in U.S. history, unless you want to count what the filthy pig bastard so-called rebels in the South did when they tried to destroy the United States in 1861, the result of which was 800,000 Americans dead. So if we discount the Civil War, we're left with the Oklahoma City bombing as the most destructive, deadliest act of terrorism in U.S. history. About 6 years later, 5 years later, the Oklahoma City National Memorial was dedicated on the site of the Murrah Federal Building. And the purpose of the memorial is to commemorate the victims of the bombing. And on April 19th, I'm sure it happened today, remembrance services are held every year. Now, the bombing occurred at just after 9 o'clock in the morning. There was a daycare center there, which Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols fully knew about. And the bombing killed 168 people, injured about 700. And if you remember, the pictures destroyed more than a third of the building. The entire front of the building had collapsed. The blast was so powerful, it also damaged over 300 other buildings. And it caused about $500 million worth of damage in 1995 dollars. I have no idea what that would be today, but who cares about the monetary damage, right? After the bombing, local, state, federal, worldwide agencies were involved in rescue efforts to try to save people, pull them out of the wreckage before they died. FEMA activated 11 of its urban search and rescue task forces. There were over 650 FEMA workers who were sent to the area to try to save people's lives. Within 90 minutes of that explosion, this domestic terrorist, this white supremacist, this Christian psycho, Timothy McVeigh, he was stopped by the Oklahoma Highway Patrol for driving without a license plate. And he was arrested for illegal weapons possession. And then forensic evidence very quickly linked McVeigh and Nichols to the attack. Nichols was arrested, and then within days, both were charged. There were two accomplices, Michael and Lori Fortier. They were later identified as accomplices. McVeigh was a psychopath who had been in the Gulf War in 1991, and he was a sympathizer with the anti-democratic neo-Nazi Klan U.S. militia movement. He had his act of terror was to detonate a Ryder rental truck full of explosives that he parked in front of the building. It was reported extensively that he was motivated by his dislike of the U.S. federal government and its handling of two events that were both of which I think was badly mishandled by the U.S. government. That was the Ruby Ridge incident in 1992, and then the siege of the Branch Davidians in Waco in 1993, led by a psychotic son of a bitch, not unlike Trump, but the psychotic son of a bitch who was in charge of Waco, thought he was the Messiah. You see how this religious shit factors into all of this. So McVeigh timed his attack to coincide with the second anniversary of the fire that ended that siege in Waco, which was, in my opinion, an act of terror by the United States government, the agencies, I guess it was the FBI, that decided, even though there were dozens of children inside, dozens of women, dozens of people who were, yes, religious psychotics, but they really hadn't done anything. I'm aware of all the subsequent charges and rumors of charges that were going to be leveled against the leader of that cult. Child pornography and drugs and weapons violations and so on and so forth. I have no idea, but what I do, the veracity of those charges, but I do know that dozens of people were burned alive as a result of the action taken by the FBI. And I think was it the Texas National Guard that participated in that attack? I don't know. The official FBI investigation of the Murrah Federal Building involved 28,000 interviews, it says here, 3,200 kilograms of evidence, nearly 1 billion pieces of information. And when the FBI raided McVeigh's home, they found a telephone number that led them to a farm where McVeigh had purchased supplies for the bombing, the fertilizer. The bombers were tried and convicted in 1997. McVeigh was executed by lethal injection 4 years later in Terre Haute, Indiana. And Terry Nichols was sentenced to life in prison, of course, with no parole in 2004. And in response to the bombing on April 19th, 1995, the U.S. Congress passed the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996, which limited access to habeas corpus in the United States, which restricted the constitutional avenues of escape, I guess would be the right word, for people convicted of these kinds of heinous crimes. The Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act also included legislation to increase the protection around federal buildings to deter further attacks by the Timothy McVeighs and Terry Nichols that are out there now. They go by the name of Proud Boys and Oath Keepers and Three Percenters and Christian nationalists. They are not Christian nationalists. They are Christian fascists. They are terrorists, every single one. They are terrorists to the same extent that the church and all of its insanity with their inquisitions were terrorists to simple people during all these inquisitions. There were several in Europe that resulted in hundreds of thousands, millions of people being executed because the church decided they should be. Very simple. So it all brings me back hideously to what is going on now. I worry very much about the potential for terrorism, incredible terrorism in this country, perpetrated by American citizens, white people, white men, and maybe a few white women if they're psychotic enough. I really worry about this because this attitude of, I don't even know what it is anymore. I mean, we live in a country where people can do pretty much what the fuck they want to do, as long as it's within the law. I realize there's some restrictions that we may not agree with, especially if we're a person of color, or if we're a woman, or if we happen to be gay, or lesbian, or trans, or what have you. Okay. But this country does not suffer from the kind of suppression that these white, fascist, insane Christian bastards use as an excuse to commit their acts of terrorism and violence. We don't live in that place. That place is Russia, which, among others, of course, I mean, North Korea, Russia, a certain area, whatever. But my question, a question I don't ask that much, I think about it, is if these white nationalists in this country, these racist pig bastards, these maggots in this country, who are now parroting the bullshit put out there through social media by Russian intelligence, if they care that much about a fascist state, if they love the propaganda put out by Putin, why don't you white devils just get the fuck out of my country? Why don't you go live in Russia? Why don't you go live in a totalitarian state? I, frankly, wish you would just fucking go away. I don't like you. You turn my stomach. You're against everything that this country has tried to do ever since we were put together as a country. But I think the reason a lot of these white fascist son of a bitches in this country don't leave is because there's a part of them that understands that they would last about 5 minutes in Russia. As soon as they opened their fucking mouths about anything they disagreed with, they would be in a gulag so goddamn quick, and probably in Siberia, where they would spend the few remaining years of their lives freezing to death. Like I said, there's not a whole lot that I feel that I can do. I'm sure you feel the same way. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. You know, the Progressive Voices Network brings you commercial-free commentary from today's leading progressive radio hosts and pundits, like me, Mike Malloy, 24 hours a day. I'm not your typical old guy from the 80s or the 90s talk radio host, and Progressive Voices is not your typical talk radio network. It's a listener-supported nonprofit with no corporate control whatsoever over our broadcast. So hosts like me, Mike Malloy, are free to rant and scream and carry on about whatever we like. We're often controversial, but we're never boring. Weeknights, 9 p.m. in the East, 6 p.m. in the West on the Progressive Voices Network. Always progressive, always on. I'm Mike Malloy. Keep it lit.